Hello and welcome to the Eastern Front. My name is Delbur Rohach and I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm joined by Julia Joja with the Middle East Institute, Georgetown and George Washington Universities. Our special guest today is Luke Coffey, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. On our podcast, we discuss security, politics and culture of Eastern Europe and their continued relevance to the United States. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Let us start with our first segment, Julia, the news from the Eastern Front. So probably the biggest single item on the news front last week was the visit of President Zelensky to the United States and the related meetings at the UN General Assembly. President Zelensky's trip to Scranton, his meetings with Vice President Harris and with the former President Donald Trump. What was your single most important takeaway from this trip and the achievements that President Zelensky could sort of bring home and present as successes of his visit?
Yeah, so Dalibor, I'm not going to comment on the Trump visit or the Trump meeting because I would love to hear you on that. But if I am to look back overall, beyond the news that much of our audience has undoubtedly followed, it wasn't surprising, but it was still toxic, is my takeaway. For 2.5 years, including, or more than 2.5 years, including on this podcast, we have sort of, or I personally have fretted or been slightly anxious about the idea of Ukraine becoming a politicized topic in the elections. And it seems that it has become one. And in a way that is toxic, but also there's not much of an opening. So essentially, I would put the blame on this becoming politicized on Trump and Trump alone. Again, I'd love to hear your comments on the visit per se, but it is baffling to me to see for Trump over the last week or so, all of those people, friends and acquaintances of mine too, that have been keeping sort of Trump support, but also Ukraine support alive and have been saying, well, he only says these things for election purposes and we shouldn't take at face value and there's still surprises. Trump has no interest in saying these really nasty things about Ukraine. I don't think he's getting a lot of votes for that. And still he insists. And the way he talks about President Putin and not putting a president in front of Zelensky, the way he and Vance and others are putting on the table essentially Ukraine sellout and neutrality cannot be driven by election reasoning, but rather by his personal preferences for Russia. So I don't know what other interpretation I can give to this. And on the other hand, this has become politicized because the other side, the Democrats, remain reluctant, right? Trump is saying Ukraine should not be our priority. And the Democrats are saying, well, yes, it should, but they're not really making a convincing case. They're not out loud saying, yes, it should be. And these are the reasons why. These are the strategic reasons why, which gives this situation beyond the elections and independent of the outcome, not much hope in the path of depoliticizing the Ukraine topic. But that's kind of it. Dalibor, do you have a more optimistic view?
Not sure if it's more optimistic. So I want to say something slightly substantive about the Trump theory of how this war ends in my recommendations segment at the end of the podcast. But I fully subscribe to the view that it is highly unfortunate that Ukraine has become a divisive political issue and that also the line of division lies between the two political parties to some extent. I think it's very obvious that the hawkish Republican old guard is not winning the argument within the Republican Party, just like the free market consensus in the Republican Party is sort of fraying in favor of a much more protectionist and sort of interventionist view of the role of government in the economy. So we can do what's within our powers to sort of strengthen those sides of the political fight within the Republican Party, but clearly there is a sort of generational change with sort of new and more energetic younger people coming in who have very different views of America's role in the world, including on Ukraine. With Trump himself, one overwhelming impression I got from those snippets of like videos of his meeting President Zelensky at Trump Tower was this sense of narcissism. How he got asked some fairly benign question about Ukraine and Zelensky, and he immediately started talking about his own impeachment and about what President Zelensky said or didn't say and how he conducted himself. In an instant, like the whole issue of Ukraine became about Trump again, just like everything, I suppose, in the former president's mind is about himself. I mean, the idea that this is just a play and that behind this facade we have a sort of hawkish, internationalist-minded president who wants to project power and seeks peace through strength. I mean, that to me is just fanciful. I mean, it's just sort of wishful thinking from people who sort of wish that the Republican Party be not moving in this direction. But the reality is that it is moving in that direction. And Trump could have picked somebody else as his running mate. Trump could have surrounded himself with people other than Laura Loomer and others. And so clearly, and the writing is on the wall. This telling moment during this photo opportunity that he had with Zelensky was when Zelensky interrupted him, suggesting that the relationship that they enjoyed was superior to the one that Trump enjoyed with Putin, which, the easiest thing in the world for Trump to just nod and say yes, of course, and he didn't. He objected, he said something, I see, and kind of like moved on in the same way he got asked about Ukrainian victory during the debate and refused to take it on and play on that theme and sort of affirm his desire to see a Ukrainian victory.
And he chose to praise Russia's historical military wins. That was odd too.
Well, then there were all these like rallies that he did last week where he talked about, Ukraine's not being a real country and how Zelensky always, comes here, always walks away with 60 billion. And so I think that signals very clearly where his sort of heart lies on this matter. So I think we'd be sort of fooling ourselves if we sort of believe that's not what the Republican position on Ukraine is going to be. On the Democratic side, I mean, again, you're right. I don't think Democrats have the sort of strength of their convictions in some sense. There's a broader problem with American foreign policy and kind of the mismatch between kind of our declared aspirations and what we are willing to do. Like in the Middle East or in the Indo-Pacific, it just doesn't cut it if we say that we wish for a certain outcome to materialize. Like for us to be able to influence events, like that requires actual commitment and resources and military power and ability to take on risks. And it strikes me that on the Democratic side, that there's a sort of big part of the political class. It cuts across parties, but you see it more on the Democratic side where people are just like unwilling to do that heavy lifting and rely on diplomacy and multilateralism and hope that somehow, if only reasonable people could get together and talk things through, that the world would sort of change for the better. And it never happens that way. Walter Russell Mead makes this point in the context of the Middle East, where you had a administration with Biden that was as committed as any in history to the peace process and diplomacy and engagement with Iran. And the results in the Middle East are quite disastrous. And I think replicating that approach in the European context, again, like without having hard power to back it and willingness to use hard power to back it, is just not going to cut it.
Does that make us move on from this side of the Atlantic for a brief stop in the former Austro-Hungarian Empire, where things are looking worse from week to week and month to month? It sounds like it's not just the far right that is driving things, but also the love for Russia. And maybe we can start with Austria and then move on to Hungary. What do you think, Dalibor?
Sure. So Austrians had an election on Sunday. In that election, the Freedom Party Austria came first. Social Democrats had the worst results in history. When you look at the distribution of seats in parliament, you can still imagine coalitions that don't involve Freedom Party Austria in government, but that will require some heavy lifting. So a sort of broad People's Party and Social Democratic coalition, I think, would barely have majority. I think it would have a majority of just one in the legislature. So that wouldn't be exactly a sort of stable arrangement. So they would have to bring in somebody else, either the Greens or a sort of centrist liberal party called NEOS. and that makes it more unstable still, just because of the sort of broad ideological distribution of the three parties involved. So the odds are that in some shape or form, the Freedom Party will be in the next government. It will be the first time, though, that it would be the strongest party in government, right?
It wouldn't be the first time, right? That's important to know. Isn't it a historical win across Europe that the number one party in elections is now the far right? Though FPÖ, the Free Austrian Party, the far right party, has been strong when others in Europe have not, right? In the 1990s, etc. So the Austrians are much more familiarized with it, but that doesn't make it politically more affable.
Yeah, no. So it's worth recalling that this was a party that was founded in the 1950s by ex-SS officers. Like, this is not a sort of, not even sort of right-wing populist or neo-Nazi party. Like, this is a party with roots that go to Nazi Germany and the SS, and people who were sort of disgruntled with how the Second World War turned out, and came up with this sort of idea that actually is rooted more deeply in Austrian political culture, that like Austria is kind of a victim, and there's like no blame that could be sort of assigned to Austrians. But anyway, like, we don't need to sort of psychoanalyze the Austrian far right, or even sort of dive too deeply in Austrian political culture. But what I think matters is that FPÖ is a party that has cultivated ties to Russia for a very long time, very deep ties. Has, I think, a sort of cooperation agreement with whatever the party of Vladimir Putin, United Russia.
I think the head of the party said that the agreement is not valid anymore, but then who can know? And the fact that they are inclined to foster cooperation party-wise after 2014 kind of speaks to it.
Karin Kneissl, who was the FPÖ foreign minister some years ago, had Vladimir Putin as the guest of honor at her wedding.
Dancing with him, I think some of our audience will remember those pictures and videos.
I mean, there is a deeper problem in Austria where, like, even the sort of centrist mainstream parties, they haven't really done anything to wean Austria off its dependence on Russian energy at a time when Germans and others have really sort of incurred significant costs to cut themselves off. There are still these pipelines going to Hungary, Slovakia, Austria, and neither of these three sort of post-Habsburg countries have done anything to change that situation. And I think FPÖ-led cabinet would clearly be in the same camp as Orban and others within the EU when it came to peace negotiations, and also I think can be expected to sort of throw sand into the gears of EU enlargement and Ukraine's accession down the road. So it's not a good piece of news. But maybe one thing I was going to say, just to put it in a bit of a context. So we talked in the previous conversation on what's happening in America, about how kind of Americans aren't willing to do the heavy lifting when it comes to European security and commit resources and back diplomacy with action. And so maybe there is a sort of more sympathetic way of looking at whether it's Austria or Hungary, which has been kind of like triangulating and forging ties with China and Russia. Like, if you sit in the heart of Europe, and if you come to the conclusion that America is getting weaker and that Americans can't really be relied on to have your back and come to the defense of Europe, maybe that makes sense. And maybe that's the world we'll have to be dealing with in the coming years, unless something substantive changes on this side of the Atlantic, that people will just make different arrangements, just like Romania did in the late 30s, early 40s, thinking that, like, in this sort of new world with the Soviets and Nazi Germany, like, you have to forge new relationships, find allies, and then it can all backfire spectacularly. But it's just sort of post-American world is going to be a very unstable one, and maybe that's what's going on in the heart of Europe right now.
Yeah, I think the parallel, maybe that enables us to move on to our last point, Hungary, but briefly here, the parallel to Romania in the 1930s is, I think, a very interesting one, because at that time, it wasn't like Romania was deeply and majority-wise invested into the far right agenda. It was parts of Romanian society, and the parliament was very much against it, but there were deals between the monarchy and the German-Austrian connection. And so basically you had an image of a country where society and political elites were split between two radically different foreign policy orientations that then led to World War II. And you have a similar picture, exactly that, in Austria and in Hungary, to some extent, Dalibor in your country, Slovakia, and others in the region, including Romania, less of an extent, but nevertheless. And this, to kind of further the context of Austria, because that's what we're talking about, this is becoming a bit of a normal situation. I've asked a couple of friends who are in politics in Austria, how are the news sinking in? How do Austrians feel about the results? And the answers were very similar in that, no, this is not something that Austrians are surprised of, that pushes anxiety. This is not unprecedented. Yes, the results are very high, but we'll have to form a coalition, and the coalition might be with the Nazis. And so that's kind of how things are. And so it is worrying because it seems like we're in a hinge moment in that region. And of course, Austria is massively free riding. They're not a member of NATO, but they're certainly benefiting from the fact that they're surrounded by NATO, and that enables their neutrality. And so it couldn't be more dangerous. And that leads us then to weird, I don't know what other words, weird interpretations of history that are happening in Budapest, the capital of Hungary, when it comes to also the last few decades. Dalibor, do you want to talk about it?
So I suppose it all is kind of a iteration of the same broad theme. So Balázs Orbán, who is the chief of staff to Viktor Orbán, the prime minister of Hungary, gave an interview this past week where he muses about the experience of Hungary in 1956 and the crushing of the Hungarian uprising by the Soviet forces, which obviously forced many Hungarians into exile and killed thousands. And his interpretation is that in the light of the Hungarian historic experience, he would not have been in favor of the sort of Zelensky response to the Russian invasion, that he would rather recommend submission to Russian rule in 2022. The exact quote, I have it in front of me, is that we have learned that one has to be cautious here and one has to treat the very precious Hungarian lives with great care. They cannot be simply thrown before others. And so he says that in the context of Hungarians dying in 1956, and the context of how many Ukrainians have died during the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia. I mean, this is, you can say it's sort of morally craven, you can say it's devalues really the legacy of people who sort of fought for Hungarian freedom in the 50s and paid the highest price for it. It's all around awful, but I think it sort of reflects something that's real, and that's part of these political cultures in places like Hungary, Austria, and Slovakia, which is specifically that in order to sort of weather geopolitical change and the rise of great powers in one's vicinity, one has to sort of keep their head down and sort of go with the grain of what's going on in sort of big global geopolitics. And so I'm almost reluctant to kind of pile on to all the critics of Balázs Orbán, but it might reflect, I mean, the fact that, yes, if the West is seen as weaker in this part of the world, this is one of the sort of forms of contingency planning that you'll see. The alternative is to be like Poland and invest into your own defenses and build alliances and so on and so forth. But not everybody will take that route. And I think in the end, taking that Hungarian, Austrian, Slovak path is going to be, I believe, detrimental to the freedom and prosperity and democracy in those countries. And I wish they made different choices, but we should remember that America has part of agency in all this as well.
Yeah, this was initially a joke, but it becomes more literal every month of this war, that at this point, the only thing that is stopping theoretically that is stopping Russia from advancing into the heart of Europe is Ukraine, because now it is confirmed that Hungary would be welcoming Russia with open arms, the Russian army, to march right through. Austria doesn't even consider the dilemma at this point. And so theoretically, then the question is, are the Germans ready to fight for European values and on behalf of Europe against Russia? I don't know. That would be the next topic topic of another theoretical podcast, but it is striking how, of course, Russian influence through money and corruption and disinformation, etc., is taking a hold in a significant part, if not a majority, of voters and reflected as such in democratic politics across Central Europe, led by Hungary, but certainly adding fans if we're looking at Austria, if we're looking partially at Slovakia, if we're looking at Serbia in that corner, and other potential victims of Russian disinformation. So it seems like being close to the front lines is not necessarily anymore a criterion the way we thought it was.
Let us now turn to our second segment, a conversation with our special guest, Luke Coffey. Luke is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, and he's also a recipient of Ukraine's Order of Merit, as well as being among those sanctioned by the Russian Federation. So it's great to have you on the podcast. The way I'd like to kick this off is by looking at your most recent work. You've been providing a steady stream of commentary and research on the war that's unfolding in Ukraine, and most recently you've been looking in some detail at the Kursk counteroffensive, the incursion by Ukrainian forces onto the territory of Russia. In a recent piece, you asked the question whether this is a risk worth taking or not. So why don't we start there? Is this, in a way, sort of strategic master move by the Ukrainians, or is this something that will backfire in the longer run?
Thanks for having me on. Yes, this is a very popular question you hear around town, and especially in Washington, D.C. Was the risk to incur into the Russian Federation worth it in terms of the amount of manpower and equipment that the Ukrainians would presumably have to move from one part of the front line now to a new part? And, while ultimately these decisions have to be made by Ukraine's military leadership, from my vantage point, knowing what I know, I would say so far it has been worth it. The Ukrainians haven't gone too far to the point where they've overstretched their front lines and their defensive positions and their logistics. It's now been, almost 2 months, and they seem to be holding on, and in some cases even gaining tactical footholds further into Kursk Oblast. And I think it does a number of things. It means that the front lines cannot be frozen where they are, because that would mean that the Russian Federation's giving up some of its territory. It also places the Ukrainians in control of some crucial motorways and rail networks, not necessarily direct control, but many of these logistical routes are now within the range of Ukrainian weapon systems. And so I think this makes Sumy Oblast that much safer for the Ukrainians.
So I was hoping that this incursion will also maybe change a little bit the name of the game here in the West. In my opinion, it's been huge conceptually. I don't think this could have happened last year. And yet here we are. We're recording the September 30th after the latest visit of Zelensky. Complex tour around and not only Washington, D.C., and a military package released, but still with a lot of taboos when it comes to the use of long-range weapons on Russian territory. And also when we're looking into the nitty-gritty of the aid, qualitatively and quantitatively, you can argue that it is far from being sufficient. So if you're looking back at the last few days, the last week in Zelensky's much anticipated visit just before US elections in a political environment that I guess naturally is becoming increasingly toxic, particularly for Ukraine. What's your main takeaway, and what is Zelensky walking away with, if anything?
Well, it's difficult to know exactly what he walked away with, because some of these issues are so, closely held. They're closely held secrets. And it takes a while for them to leak out or for them to get out to the general public. I mean, let's not forget that when President Zelensky visited, this time last year, the big focus then was getting the ATACMS. And then we all thought he left empty-handed. And then a few weeks later in October of last year, we woke up to discover that 2 Russian airfields inside occupied Ukraine were targeted by 15 or 20 ATACMS missiles, which led to the destruction of, I think it was like 11% of Russia's attack helicopter fleet. So who knows exactly what was decided, what was agreed upon. I like to hope that there was some sort of breakthrough or some sort of agreement on the use of American-made, American-provided long-range weapon systems that can be used to hit military targets inside the Russian Federation. I mean, this only makes sense. I think these fears about escalation are unfounded. American weapons have already probably led to the deaths of 100 to 200,000 Russian soldiers inside Ukraine. So why do we think using American missiles to hit Russian airfields inside Russia is going to be what tips Vladimir Putin over to escalating? And also, I wonder how much more could he possibly escalate? Do you mean to tell me he's holding back something that he could be using against Ukraine? And I don't think he's going to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine. So I think the jury's still out on what the visit yielded in terms of results. Now, one area where I feel like the Ukrainians missed an opportunity is articulating and communicating in an operational security compliant manner what this 4-point victory plan is. I follow Ukraine issues every single day, all day long. I think I know what 2 of the 4 are, but I don't know what they all are. And this has created a vacuum of information where just people go on television, they go on radio, they go on podcasts, and they just speculate what these points might be. So I thought the way it was kind of presented and not rolled out was actually unhelpful.
Let me just quickly follow up on that and say the only comment we've gotten was, I think, in the New York Times, if I'm not mistaken, quoting some anonymous senior official from the United States that expressed unhappiness with the fact that the plan was not presenting anything but the possibility of military gains with military weapons, with military instruments. So what do you make of that?
Surprise! Ukraine's in a war. Imagine they want to have military victories.
So it's interesting to have you on because in some ways you're sort of like echoing, I think, the tone of the coverage last week, which was, again, like these leaks about the Americans not being particularly impressed with what they were presented by the Ukrainians. I mean, at the same time, given the sort of balance of power on the battlefield and the reasonable asks that the Ukrainians can make on the Americans, what would be a sort of compelling plan for Ukrainian victory on the battlefield that would not rely on really sort of heroic assumptions about our ability to scale up our assistance or about, relaxing the domestic political constraints in Ukraine towards conscription and getting more people into the military and training. I mean, I think some version of what is going on is close to what is possible given where the sort of assistance is and where the sort of domestic pace in Ukraine is for the mobilization. So I think the sort of asks that the Ukrainians can make are in some sense political in nature at this stage. Or is there some sort of mastermind sort of like scenario that can sort of materialize on the battlefield with enough strategic genius on the Ukrainian side?
Yeah, I do believe that providing Ukraine the weapons and the assistance needed for them to win and not just to survive, it would be a good starting point for the U.S. I mean, it seems like the Biden administration has done just enough for Ukraine to make it look like something's being done without actually ensuring that the Ukrainians are victorious on the battlefield. Now, one subtle difference that I noticed coming out of the White House just in the past couple of days when President Zelensky visited was all the official statements now talk about until Ukraine wins, supporting Ukraine until it wins, whereas before it was supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes, which nobody liked. But now we're moving on to supporting Ukraine until it wins, which is great, but that means we need to do something about it because now we have more of a say in this end state. I would like to see the restrictions on long-range missiles and other munitions being lifted. I would like to see us prioritize giving Ukraine more of these weapon systems and munitions, air defense systems. I don't see what good it is to have an air defense system set in the middle of the United States when right now this can have the greatest geopolitical impact on the front lines in Ukraine. I think we have to recognize the historical moments in which we are living, and then we need to live up to this with our aid and our support. This is the stuff that will be read about in my children's history books as they grow up. We need to start acting and behaving this way. This isn't just some sort of, fly-by minor conflict in Eastern Europe. This is arguably the largest armed conflict the world has seen in decades.
Let me ask you a follow-up question, a political one, and if you'd like, you can dodge it. But it seemed to me from the visit of President Zelensky last week that it's not just a subtle change in tone when things come out of the White House, but that Vice President Harris was for the first time using a more assertive tone. Now, when it comes to Putin personally, not when it comes to Russia, but nevertheless, did you read it in a similar way, or do you have, I guess, hopes that if Vice President Harris would win elections, that she could actually orchestrate a change in strategy, or rather in policy, compared to President Biden when it comes to Ukraine? Or do you think it's going to be more of the same, a combination between Biden and Obama when it comes to Ukraine and Russia?
See, when I heard Vice President Harris side by side with President Zelensky, I had nothing else to compare that to, because that was the first time that I really heard Kamala Harris talk about Ukraine in this context of potentially being president of the United States, right? So there was nothing really for me to compare it to other than statements that she has made in the past as vice president, which has basically echoed the administration's point of view. I am concerned either way for Ukraine after November. Either Kamala Harris wins and we have a continuation of this policy of muddling along, helping Ukraine enough to make it look like we're doing something and to make us feel good about ourselves, but not enough to have a decisive outcome on the battlefield. Or we have President Trump that wins and, by all accounts, he wants to force some sort of settlement onto the Ukrainians, which perhaps could bring some stability or some calmness to the front lines, maybe for the duration of his presidency. But I promise you, Russia will not see this as a finale to the situation. They'll be right back at the first chance after they take this breathing time to rearm, re-equip, reman their armed forces. So things aren't looking good, if I'm being frank, for Ukraine. Now, I hope I'm wrong on those accounts, but that's just my objective analysis.
Stepping aside from whoever controls the executive in Washington, what's your sense of how much money there is to be spent from the most recent supplemental bill? And B, once that money is spent, what do you think the path towards a new assistance package for Ukraine looks like? And when can we expect to be kind of fighting this battle? And how much have the sort of front lines shifted in either party? I mean, is there a sort of growing constituency among Democrats who would support a more muscular approach to this? Have the sort of Ukraine skeptical voices become stronger in the Republican Party? How is this going to be similar and different from the most recent iteration of this debate?
Public spending is about establishing national priorities. That's whether it's a domestic program, a welfare program, transportation, whatever. And that includes military projects, foreign policy, foreign aid. This is about establishing priorities that we have as a nation. And it's clearly in America's interest that Ukraine is secure and safe and victorious on the battlefield. I could make the case on why this is so, but I've done so many times, and I don't want to take up time here that we have today. But it is in America's interest that Ukraine is successful. So if our leadership wants to explain to the American people why this matters, they can do this. I mean, the Americans want to be led on foreign policy, and we need to have the White House better articulate why it matters and how we can afford to do this. We need to explain to the American people that what we're giving to Ukraine is actually, very little in terms of, a percentage of GDP. I mean, this war has gone on for 2.5 years or so. Over the same period of time, the U.S. has given the equivalent of less than 1/4% of America's GDP. Now, if you're listening to this, imagine that America's GDP is represented by $1. Take 100 pennies, take one of those pennies out, cut that penny into 4 pieces, and then hold one of those pieces up. That is the amount we've given to Ukraine since February of 2022. This is nothing. We could give much more if we wanted to, if we thought it was in our interest to do so. And I think it is. When I'm on Capitol Hill and I speak to members of Congress from both parties, I still find bipartisan support for Ukraine. And I think most Americans remain supportive of Ukraine, even 2.5 years on. So I think we need to harness this, and our political leadership needs to lead on this issue in front of the American people.
Before we let you go, even though the last statement of take a penny and cut it into quarters is quite a good way to go, but we won't let you go quite yet. We want to ask you also to move slightly away from from Ukraine, but stay on the Eastern Front or Eastern flank. You've been working for a long time now on the Caucasus, and we've covered it on the podcast extensively. We have crucial elections coming up in Georgia too, now in October 2024. And the situation in Georgia is, I guess, unprecedentedly bad, and chances are very slim that things could turn around. When I was there a few months ago, people were telling me this is the Belarusization of Georgia. What's your take on Georgia and the Caucasus broadly in the context of, you must have heard it many times as well, people, experts in Georgia and beyond saying the only thing that can change things around is a positive outcome of the war in Ukraine. So what's your view on the Caucasus and on Georgia?
Yeah, Georgia is a country that I've followed closely for years, and I visited it more times than I can remember. And it's a country that I love. I love the history, the culture, the food, the people. And, it saddens me to see what is happening there. In a nutshell, for those who are not familiar or up to speed with what's going on in Georgia, in 2012, a new government came into power, basically with the sole platform of getting rid of the previous government. And this new government was a coalition that had pro-European parties, pro-NATO parties, pro-US parties, but it was built around the core of a party called the Georgian Dream. Now, over the years, the pro-European parties kind of fell by the wayside, were pushed out, left the government, and now we're left with this hardcore, inner core Georgian Dream government that is, if not aligned with many of Moscow's views and positions around the world, they're certainly sympathetic to Moscow's worldview. And we have crucial elections that are coming up next month that will define, at least in the medium term, Georgia's trajectory. Either it will get back on its path to Euro-Atlantic integration, or it'll fall neatly into Russia's sphere of influence and Russia's orbit. Now, I am cautiously optimistic that the electorate and the civil society is energized enough to where you might see some change later in October. One of the main reasons why is they're using a new electoral system where it's a fully proportional representational election system as opposed to a mixed system they had where some seats were elected with a majoritarian system, some were elected with a proportional system. So I think this will create an opportunity for the different opposition groups to maybe form a common platform, form a coalition government. But the big question is, will the incumbent Georgian Dream government allow this to happen? And the even bigger and deadlier question is, will Moscow allow this to happen? And, Georgia is important not only because it used to represent this beacon of hope in what is a very unstable region, but from a geopolitical point of view, Georgia's location on the map, in the South Caucasus, where all the major trade routes, the east-west trade routes that bypass Russia and Iran pass through, Georgia is important not only to Europe's security, but by extension, America's security. So we'll have to see what's happening there later this month. I am cautiously optimistic that there could be some change for the better.
That's a reasonably hopeful note on which we have to wrap up. We have to have you back and talk about Georgia some more because it's a country that's, I think, close to all of our hearts, and we do intend to dedicate at least an episode to the Georgian election later in October. With that, Luke Coffey, thank you so much for joining us on the Eastern Front.
Thank you so much for having me.
In the third segment, I have a very shameless plug for my own work. I did a piece for The Spectator magazine last week, just ahead of the Zelensky-Trump meeting, in which I looked at the Trump theory of how the war in Ukraine ends. So President Trump said repeatedly that he wants to strike a deal and want to bring this to an end. And he says the war is awful, it can't go on, neither side can win, let's strike a deal. Which, okay, I sort of get the sentiment, but this desire to reach a deal strikes me as being in direct contradiction with other important part of the Trump agenda, which is his disdain for NATO, his potential desire to withdraw from the alliance or to turn the alliance into a sort of transactional protection racket in which the United States would sort of pick selectively whom to come to the defense of and whom to kick out of the alliance. And the reason for why there is this contradiction is that for any deal to stick, whether it's negotiated by Trump or by somebody else, and Ukrainians must be reassured and must be confident that deal will stick. And the most reliable way of making any deal stick is for Ukraine or for what remains of Ukraine to be part of NATO or to be extended NATO-like guarantees by the United States. And if you think that that is by definition a terrible deal for the United States, that this is a way for Europeans to free ride on America's military and defense spending, then you can't really be a sort of deal maker in Europe without carrying some of the burden of Europe's defenses. So if Trump wants to really, get out of NATO or transfer the bulk of the conventional deterrence that NATO entails to Europeans, then he can't really play the role of the deal maker that he fancies himself to be. If on the contrary, he wants to be at the center of negotiations about Ukraine's future and about peace in Eastern Europe, then he has to be ready to, bolster American support for the alliance and bring Ukraine into NATO and make sure that the Americans have a sufficient deterrent force in Eastern Europe. Just can't have your cake and eat it too. So that was the argument of my Spectator piece. Thank you for listening to The Eastern Front, a podcast on the security, politics and culture of Eastern Europe and about their continued relevance to the United States. You can find more episodes and additional content on our website, ai.org, where you can also subscribe to receive our newsletter. We are also on X, on LinkedIn and on other social media platforms. Please don't be strangers. Send us your tips for future guests and topics you'd like us to cover. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider rating, reviewing and subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you and goodbye.